Hi, witches. I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week. Happy New Year, my spooky friends. We are all just now celebrating ringing in 2025. But we can't help but wonder what the future holds for each of us. With so many horrors lurking around us, making it to the end of the year seems uncertain. We must be grateful for every moment we have, because the end of the world could be just a blink away. And the countdown to midnight might be the last we ever hear. First, stitched together, then torn apart, followed by something is watching you. Finally, in our last story, the sound of torture. Before we get started, I also wanted to ask if you had a chance to check out our merch shop. It's filled with lots of awesome new products, beanies, blankets, and beer mugs. No, I think they're just coffee mugs, but whatever your beverage of choice, go to somethingscary.com to check it out now. We also have a whole new collection called Camp Scary with fun t-shirts, hats, and beanies. So, want to hear something scary? The end of the world. Some doors should never be opened, no matter how real the nightmare feels, like in this story inspired by Ishita. I wasn't sure about the time. I opened my eyes. The floor was cold. My back was pressed against the bathroom tiles, my legs sprawled out in front of me like a discarded mannequin. My body felt heavy, like I had been there for hours or longer. I sat up slowly, the harsh light buzzing overhead making my head throb. The last thing I remembered was the party, that bizarre basement party in the old brownstone building, New Year's Eve. My friends had said it was just a theme, the end of the world. The kind of thing hipsters put together to be ironic, but it hadn't felt ironic. The masks, the candles, the chants, and that low, droning hum. It felt wrong, satanic even. I couldn't remember how I got there or why I stayed so long. Someone had handed me a drink, then nothing, just dark. Now I was here. I pulled myself up, using the sink for balance. My reflection stared back, ghost pale and slick with sweat. Hair stuck to my face. My shirt was damp and clinging to my body. I looked at the water-streaked tap, needing something, anything to shake me awake. But as I reached for it, I heard something. A growl. It came from somewhere deep in the walls. My chest tightened. It froze. It was low and guttural, so unnatural that it felt like the building itself was alive. I listened. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no doors opening, just silence. My breath came out in shaky gasps. I grabbed the door handle, the brass cold and damp in my grip. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, but I couldn't. I needed to get out. The door creaked open. The hallway was wrong. The lights flickered, casting shadows that shifted and skittered around the grimy walls. The air reeked of something rotten, the kind of smell that settled in your throat. I took one step forward, then another. That was when I saw them. At first, my brain refused to process it. Figures were lurching toward me, human-shaped, but wrong, their limbs twisted at impossible angles. Legs where arms should be, heads drooping to one side, their jaws split into two wide smiles. Their skin was torn, stitched back together like someone had played surgeon with no instructions. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. One of them tilted its head, milky white eyes locking onto mine. Then they all turned, smiles widening. A sound rose from them, a horrible wet rasp of laughter. And then they moved, crawling, stumbling, clawing their way toward me. I stumbled back, trying to slam the door, but so many hands reached through, grabbing at me, pulling me into the writhing mass. I fought, but they were everywhere, dragging me down, tearing at me like wolves. Pain exploded through me, sharp and deep. I screamed. I woke up. I was back on the bathroom floor. The same tiles, the same cold, damp air. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up, my body shaking. I clawed at my arms, checking for cuts, bruises, stitches, but I was whole. I looked up at the mirror. My reflection stared back, wide-eyed and trembling. "It's just a dream," I muttered, my voice shaky. But it wasn't. It couldn't be. I looked at the door again. I didn't want to open it, but I had to. I needed to get out. As I reached for the knob, my brain lurched with a sick realization. Those things, they looked like the creatures in the story I'd been writing last night. A story about a world torn apart, where humans were stitched back together wrong, patchwork, and broken. I forced the thought down and twisted the handle. The hallway stretched out again, empty at first. I stepped out cautiously, my shoes scuffing against the tile. The light sputtered overhead and the shadows writhed like they were alive. I thought maybe I could make it out, until I saw them. Hundreds of eyes blinked at me from the dark. The creatures stepped forward, crooked smiles pulling at their skin. Their laughter, that awful, choking sound, filled the hallway. I didn't have time to move. They crashed into me, dragging me down, pulling me apart. The pain was back. Worse this time. My bones splintered. My muscles tore. I was screaming, but I couldn't hear it over their laughter. My vision flickered like the lights above me, and then darkness. I woke up again. This time, I was in my room. I bolted upright in bed, my body soaked in sweat, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. I forced myself to take a breath. "It's over," I whispered. "It's done." But when I looked at the window, there was nothing outside. No city lights, no moon. Just a void of endless blackness. My throat tightened. I reached for the clock, but there was nothing there. The wall was damp when I touched it, and when I pulled my hand back, it was smeared red. Then I saw them. They were here, in my room. The creatures lined the walls, their heads twitching, their stitched grins dripping with malice. One step closer, its voice a rasp that scraped the inside of my skull.
"It's always New Year's here."
I stumbled back, my body screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. They closed in, hands grabbing, tearing, pulling me apart again. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I woke up. I was on the bathroom floor. I sat up, my head pounding. I didn't want to look at the mirror. I didn't touch the door. I pulled my knees to my chest, looking my arms around me. I didn't know if it was real anymore, or if it ever had been. How long had I been there? Was it still New Year's Eve? Had it passed? Or was I stuck, looping through this nightmare over and over? The light above me flickered. Somewhere deep in the walls, I heard that growl again. I closed my eyes, pressing my forehead on my knees. I wouldn't open the door again, not this time. Would you open the door knowing what might be waiting on the other side? If time stopped moving, would you even realize it? Have you ever had the feeling time was standing still? Sometimes the quietest places hide the most terrifying secrets, and the deeper you go, the harder it becomes to escape. Like in this story inspired by Anonymous. The snow fell silently, blanketing the road in an untouched layer of white as four friends, Mara, Javi, Liam, and Jess, trudged through the woods. The car had broken down hours ago on a desolate back road, miles from town. The sounds of celebration, muted by distance and snow, lingered somewhere far off. But here, there was only the crunch of boots and the sound of their own breathing. No one had expected the night to take this turn. The plan was simple: a drive to a friend's cabin, a small party to ring in the new year, a quiet escape from the loud chaos of the city. But the engine sputtered out. At the worst possible place, and without cell reception or even a trace of a signal, they had decided to head toward the distant glow of lights they could just make out through the trees. Just a little bit further, Mara told herself. She led the way, steady and determined, but the quiet unnerved her. Jess stayed close behind while Javi and Liam, weighed down with backpacks, walked a few paces back. Every so often, Liam would stop, glancing around as if the woods were hiding something just out of view. None of them wanted to admit how long it had been since they'd seen anything resembling a path. The woods seemed alive, not with wildlife, but with something else. The trees loomed impossibly tall, their bare branches stretching like skeletal fingers. The snow made everything too quiet. The deeper they went, the colder it seemed to grow. Frost clung to Jess's eyelashes as she murmured, "Feels like a horror movie here." No one responded, but they all silently agreed. Finally, the trees thinned, and they came upon an old farmhouse. It sat in the middle of a clearing, its roof sagging, its windows dark. Something about it seemed untouched by time, as though it had simply appeared there waiting for them. Breaking the silence, Javi said they should check it out. Mara hesitated but agreed. Shelter was better than freezing. The door creaked open when Javi pushed it, the sound loud enough to make Jess flinch. Inside, the air was still and stale. It was warmer than outside, but not by much. The house had clearly been abandoned for years. Dust clung to every surface and the floors groaned under their weight. Shadows pulled in the corners, so dark they seemed to swallow the faint light leaking through the grime-covered windows. Liam dropped his bag in the entryway and looked around. "Better than nothing," he muttered. They exploded cautiously, their footsteps echoing. The house had a strange, empty feeling, as though it had been waiting. In the living room, they found remnants of another time, a worn couch, an old clock frozen at 11:57, and a fireplace long gone cold. "We should build a fire," Mara said, kneeling to check the hearth. Bits of wood remained brittle and dry. She didn't want to think about how they seemed arranged, almost deliberate. Jess couldn't help but laugh at how absurd it all was. She noted that they never taught them real stuff in school. Stuff like how to build a fire if you were about to freeze to death. Javi and Liam got to work moving furniture, laying out blankets, trying to make the space livable. Javi kept glancing at the clock, its unmoving hands making him uneasy. He pulled Jess aside after a while, lowering his voice. "This place doesn't feel right. Like we're not alone. Have you noticed?" Jess just nodded, hugging her arms. "It's like the house is watching us." Hours passed. Midnight approached, but no one said it aloud. The fire crackled weakly, casting flickering shadows on the walls. They sat close to the flames, saying little. Time felt strange here, as though it stretched and bent, and the cold from the outside had begun to creep in again, no matter how high they stoked the fire. Liam broke the silence. "The clock!" They turned to look. The hands were moving. Mara frowned. "That's not possible. It's broken." But the ticking sound grew louder, filling the room, beating in time with their racing hearts. 11:58. The second hand jerked forward, spasmodic and unnatural. 11:59. The fire guttered, throwing the room into shadow. The walls groaned, the sound like something breathing in the dark. "We need to leave," Jess whispered, her voice shaky. The front door slammed shut. Javi rushed to it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck!" A wind picked up inside the house, rattling the windows, howling through unseen cracks. The temperature dropped so sharply, it stole the breath from their lungs. Something moved in the corner of Mara's vision, a shadow pulling itself free from the darkness. The clock struck midnight. The sound was deafening, a single toll that seemed to shake the entire house. The shadows in the room deepened, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. Liam grabbed at Mara's arm, his eyes wide. "It's here." The fire died completely, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no light, just the oppressive weight of something unseen. Then Jess screamed. The shadows moved. They poured across the floor, crawling up the walls, spilling from the corners like ink. Mara grabbed Jess, pulling her toward the door. Javi and Liam followed, their movements panicked. "It's coming!" Javi shouted, but no one dared look back. The door opened suddenly, as if the house had grown tired of the game. They stumbled into the snow, gasping for breath. Behind them, the farmhouse sat in perfect stillness, dark and empty again, as though nothing had happened. The snow fell heavier now, erasing their footsteps as they fled into the woods. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They didn't look back until they reached the road again, where the broken-down car sat like a forgotten relic. From the clearing, the faint sound of a clock ticking reached them, impossibly loud against the silence of the snow. What would you do if you were stranded in the middle of nowhere and no way to contact anyone, and a house appeared out of nowhere? Has it ever happened to you? How did you survive? Tell us your story by sending us an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. There's nothing more haunting than a sound you know shouldn't exist, like in this story written by Sara. It was midnight on New Year's Eve, and the party was now in full swing. The living room was packed with people laughing and shouting, while music blared from the speakers. Harper stood by the window, trying to take a breather from the chaos. She pulled her coat tighter around her, feeling the chill in the air as she stared out into the street. Outside, the usual New Year's celebration was alive with the distant sound of fireworks and honking horns. The clock on the wall ticked over to 12 o'clock. People cheered, raising their drinks, but as the cheers died down and the music faded into a low hum, something else cut through the noise. A bell. At first, Harper thought it was part of the usual midnight celebrations. The university clock tower always chimed at 12, but this wasn't right. 1 bong, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then the 13th, a deep, low bong that rattled the walls of the house. It seemed to stretch longer than the others, like it was trying to force its way into her mind. Harper's stomach dropped. She glanced around the room, but no one else seemed to have heard it. Her friends were still talking, dancing, laughing, oblivious to the sound that had frozen her in place. The 13th bell. It was a college legend everyone knew, but no one truly believed. They said that every year at midnight on New Year's Eve, clock tower would strike 12. But if you heard the 13th bell, it meant something was watching, something that would come for you before the year was out. Harper had always laughed it off. It was a bit spooky, passed around by upperclassmen trying to mess with freshmen. But now, as the echoes of the bell faded into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was real. She tried to shrug it off as just her imagination. The party was still going, and her friends were all still wrapped up in the festivities. The laughter, the clinking glasses, and the music all felt muffled now, like she was underwater. The next morning, Harper couldn't shake the unease she felt. At first, she chalked it up to the overindulgence of partying the night before, but as the days wore on, the feeling didn't fade. In fact, it grew stronger. Every time she walked past the university's clock tower, the bell seemed to echo louder in her mind, and she found herself glancing up at it, expecting the sound to ring again at any moment. She tried to push it aside. There were exams, papers to write, friends to catch up with, but something about the 13th bell, it was as if it had become a part of her. At night, it was even worse. Alone in her dorm room, the silence would press down on her. Her clock read midnight, and though there was no sound, she would lay awake, waiting for it. The tolling, the slow, inevitable descent into madness. The 13th bell would strike again. She just knew it. By March, Harper's friends had started to notice. At first, they thought it was just stress from midterms, but soon it was clear that something was off. Harper's eyes were sunken from lack of sleep, her pale skin, her movements slow and distant. She was avoiding going out, no longer responding to texts as quickly as before. "What's going on with you?" Claire, her roommate, asked one night. "You've been acting strange. Are you still hearing that bell?" Harper froze, the blood draining from her face. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. What could she say? How could she explain the crushing dread, the torment that the 13th bell had caused? It was like something had been set in motion that night, something that couldn't be stopped. "I'm fine," Harper finally said, her voice tight. "Just need some sleep. I'll be okay." But she wasn't okay. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt truly at peace. She had become an obsession, a constant threat that loomed over her, pushing her deeper into madness. At night, her dreams were filled with a low, rumbling toll. She'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, only to find the bell was still ringing in her head. Clock tower, the streetlights, the faces of her friends, they all blurred into one indistinguishable void, filled with the haunting sound of that one bell. By November, Harper's world had narrowed to a single, terrifying truth. The 13th bell had claimed her. The year was almost over, and she was no closer to understanding what it all meant other than knowing she was going to die. There was no escaping it. The 13th bell would strike again, and when it did, it would take her. The end of the year approached, and Harper felt herself on the brink of something dark. On December 31st, Harper locked herself in her room, hoping that the bell would not come for her. She tried to push back the anxiety, but as midnight approached, she couldn't help herself. She stood by her window, her hands trembling, watching the clock tick closer to the moment. When the clock finally struck 12, she braced herself. The bell rang. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then 13. It was louder this time, like a monstrous thing, vibrating the very air around her. The walls seemed to crack, the floor beneath her feet trembled. Harper froze, her heart pounding in her chest. But then, nothing. The ringing stopped. A heavy silence filled the room. The air felt thick with anticipation, but nothing else came. No cold gust of wind, no shadowy figure, no malevolent force dragging her into hell. It was over. The bell had rung, but there was no consequence, no curse, no death. For the first time in a year, Harper took a deep breath. The weight she had carried for so long lifted, vanishing as if it had never been. She fell to her knees, a wave of relief washing over her. She cried then, her sobs of fear turning into cries of joy. She couldn't believe it. All this time, all the terror, all the sleepless nights, and for what? For nothing. It had all been in her mind, a cruel trick of her own making. She felt the release in every fiber of her body. She laughed through her tears. I'm so stupid, she whispered to herself, a sense of clarity settling in. Why did I ever let it haunt me all year? For the first time in a long while, Harper felt alive again, as if a weight had been lifted. She stood, a smile creeping onto her face, kind of smile that only comes with a new beginning. She threw open her window, breathing in the cold night air, filling her lungs with a freedom she hadn't realized she had been missing. Harper stepped away from the window, already planning out her next steps. She would make the most of every second. No more hiding, no more obsessing over things she couldn't control. The world was wide open for her to take. And so she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. As she stepped outside, the night was still and quiet, a crisp winter air hanging around her. It was nearly peaceful, so she didn't see the car slam into her body. The world seemed to freeze. Harper barely registered the sound of the impact, the blur of motion, probably because this car didn't even have its headlights on. In a matter of seconds, everything went black. Have you ever heard a sound that shouldn't exist? Did it haunt you? Tell us about it by sending us your story at somethingscary@snarled.com. This week's podcast stories were edited by Sara Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sandalo and Calvin Linderman.